Today on Uncommon Sense, Grettelyn and I speak with one of the speakers for the upcoming Chesterton conference this summer, Joe Walsh, who will be talking about G.K. Chesterton and Whittaker Chambers. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome, viewers and listeners, to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'm the Vice President for Evangelization and Mission here at the Society, and I'm joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Grettelyn Darkey. Hi, Grettelyn.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And we have, as promised, one of our speakers with us today. So as regular viewers and listeners to the podcast over several years will know, in the lead up to our conferences, we like to bring the speakers on and allow you an opportunity to get to know them a little bit and maybe to see a little bit about what they'll be speaking about. And very thrilled on the podcast today to have Joe Walsh from Minneapolis. Hi, Joe.
Hey, good to be here.
Well, great to have you. And I saw I was reading the biography that you'll have on the website when we launched the app for the conference. You were describing your longtime membership in the local Chesterton Society out there in Minneapolis. How long have you been participating out there?
About 20 years. Yeah, a good friend of mine was bugging me about getting involved probably a couple years before that, and whatever, busy with kids and different things, and kind of no. And then finally, I got hit by multiple sources in one summer. They're all like from different people, completely unexpected. They're like, you got to go to the Chesterton conference. You got to go. So yeah, 2004 in St. Paul at the seminary. And I was blown away. It was so fun. It was just a thrill to be there. And the kind of talks I've never heard anywhere else, the kind of people I had not met very often. And so, yeah, this is just super exciting. So from 2004 on, I've been a very enthusiastic member.
Yeah, and I saw that you've attended at least 10 conferences. That's about the same number as me. So between those years, we certainly have crossed paths at one point. But this is nice to. I don't know if we've ever actually gotten to meet at the Afterglow or anything. So it's a pleasure to finally meet you, so to speak, in person.
Yeah, no, I remember you giving a talk at the Milwaukee conference. So that's kind of my first time seeing, you give a talk. I don't think we met, but yeah.
Great. Well, this is the great thing about Chesterton Society. And for all of those out there watching on YouTube or listening to this on your radio, this is just a sign that you could start coming to the conferences, join your local society, and maybe one day you'll get to be a speaker at one of our conferences. So
after like 20 years,
Yeah, you got to put in your time a little bit.
It actually wasn't even my idea. I mean, I had started reading about Whittaker Chambers, and I said, Dale, this is so awesome. Like, I had heard talks, other pairings. James Woodruff did a remarkable job on Pascal. And it was such a memorable time. And it moved me. I mean, it just it hit a chord in me. It was like, it's a little bit of history. It's a little bit of a biography. It's a little bit of a contrast and compare. I was like, this is fantastic stuff. You got to do one on Whittaker Chambers. And of course, he just said, well, that means you're volunteering to write something about Whittaker Chambers. So it was not planned. I just said it would be a great idea. And he said, yeah, it would. You should do it. So here we are.
Sounds like Dale all over. Very, very fascinating subject. But before we dive into your talk, would you mind just telling our readers and listeners a little bit more, our listeners a little bit more about you?
Sure. So currently I'm grandpa. Just had our first grandson.
Congrats.
I live in St. Paul. So we have two kids. We have a girl and a boy. Our daughter is married and living in Duluth, and she has three children, and so that's fun having the grandchildren around. And yeah, I mean, I put a little bit on the biography. I've been involved in a lot of kids coaching of sports and doing things at the school, and been on a number of different ministries, over the years. Love to golf, fish. I just actually met up with an old friend of mine, and we went golfing and fishing in Louisiana, and it was just a remarkable event. It was kind of a reunion of sorts. 3 of my old friends from Net got together, and it was just fun. We were 5 days. So for me, it's a big deal to go somewhere warm a few days in the winter. So we went somewhere warm. We didn't catch any fish, but we had a lot of laughs and told a lot of the old stories. And my friends were very excited and very interested when I told them a little bit. I said, yeah, I'm really involved in Chesterton now, and excited about that. So that we talked about that too, even. So on the fishing trip, it was great. It was really fun.
Well, with that background, in net ministries and working with, different apostolates over the years, you said you joined the Chesterton Society or started attending meetings and going to the conferences back in 2004, but were you a longtime Chesterton reader before that, or how did you discover G.K. Chesterton to read?
Great question. Never. No. I had not heard of Chesterton. I heard of him a couple of years before when friends were starting to say, go to the conference, you'll love it. But no, hadn't read anything, or maybe in passing, at a homily, I'd hear a priest say a quote or something. He's such a quotable guy, but I didn't really know anything about him. And then, funny story, one of the very first things, I used to have to drive a lot for work. So I had a lot of road time. And so somebody said, well, you say you're too busy. You're in the car a lot. Here, listen to this Chesterton book on audio. So got a stack of CDs, and I'm listening to The Man Who Was Thursday while driving. And I remember it's like chapter 2 or chapter 3 where, Syme goes into the bomb room, and it's just, and I'm like, I almost drove off the road. It was just so exciting. It was really fun to listen to this spy thriller and, whatever Job analogy. And it kind of blew my mind. I mean, it was really it was a really fun place to start. Everyone could say a different place to start with Chesterton. For me, it just happened to be an audiobook of The Man Who Was Thursday, and it was really, really fun. And I was just completely grabbed by that. And then the conference, and then meeting people. And so it was just fantastic.
That does sound a little dangerous, though. As soon as you said I was listening as I was driving, I was like, uh-oh. this could go a number of ways. That's so wonderful, though. That's such a great book. I think it's a starter for a few people. But it's a great segue into your talk, too. Tell us a little bit about Whittaker Chambers and why Whittaker Chambers and Chesterton.
Yeah. So great question. So it's kind of a funny thing, but I think it's kind of a natural transition. So probably like a lot of people, when the world closed in 2020, when everything rolled, all cities rolled up their sidewalks, you'd see pictures of New York City with 2 people on the street. The question in my mind, maybe in a lot of people's mind, is what is going on? And I think, my gut instinct, I'm not that bright, but I was like, there's more going on than what's going on. Yes, people are getting sick from a virus, but there's some kind of strange totalitarian control going on. And I was chatting with friends about it, and we were kind of, we were being very Chestertonian. We were deliberately disobeying the don't get together with friends rules and getting together with friends. And I said, I was asking people, different questions. And one of the guys said, hey, there's this great book. It's called Witness by Whittaker Chambers. And he goes, it's just really fantastic. You should read it. And And so I did, and it's a humongous book. I think if you look it up on Audible, it's like 29 hours. So it's not an easy read. It's not, well, it's a fairly easy read. It's just a very long read. But I was super inspired by Whittaker Chambers. I was super inspired by his, I will say, kind of his heroic long suffering. I mean, he really was hated for his beliefs. He really was hated for trying to stand up to really what was going on in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I think he was grossly misunderstood by most of the population. I don't know. I just had I walked away from reading that book very inspired. And then there was, of course, immediately all these Chesterton, similarities, which really were fun. Like, so I won't give much of the talk away, but like, here's a little carrot. So, the old story, Chesterton getting all his jobs with journalism. What do you want to write about? You can write about anything except politics and religion. And Chesterton says, and I went on to spend the rest of my life writing about politics and religion. So there's an almost identical story. Whittaker Chambers worked for Time magazine. And they realized he was a phenomenal writer, a phenomenal editor. He had incredible insight on a lot of things. And he worked his way up. And then one of the, VPs, top brass says, what do you want to write about? And he says, politics and religion. And he says, the look of horror on the face of his boss, and he shot back, I wouldn't dare. He's like so shocked that here this communist spy, because he was very open about what his past was like and what his background, and that he had this conversion, and that he was, firmly writing about his faith and more of a conservative tone. And they allowed him to write about politics and religion the rest of his time at Time. And he wrote some great articles. And so I had to laugh when I heard the comparison right away. I was like, oh, yeah. Anyway, so that made me think of Chesterton. That there's so many things in there. Chambers is certainly a much, I'll say, if I had one word to describe him, it's heavy. Now, Chesterton is also heavy, physically, a large man. Chambers, but he was very light and lighthearted. Chambers is very heavy. Like, reading him is you're reading something pretty serious. And, he really I think he had a lot more pain in his entire life than Chesterton. So all of his writing takes on kind of who he was. He had a very bad childhood. He had a very bad family. He had, a suicidal brother. I mean, he had all kinds of pain in his life. And so the writing has a little bit of that tone throughout the whole book.
It's very Russian too. Kind of not surprising that he would. You read the Russian authors and they're all very you could feel that heaviness and that roughness, and then you get this guy who is in league with the Soviets, and it's kind of makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, kind of where you started there with, how I think. However, one lands about sort of the closing down and everything that our society went through at that period, what was sort of most astonishing was just to see such quick kind of behavioral reversals and pattern reversals in sort of, I was listening to a podcaster the other day talking about how suddenly the liberal left was in love with big pharma, which you wouldn't have, when I was growing up, that wouldn't have been an easy prediction to make. You know what I mean? It was just very strange to see these realignments and how compliant, a populace can be. And I think this is something that both Chesterton and Chambers, kind of witness against in their writings. That the capacity to think for oneself, to think thoroughly through an issue, to try to avoid just going along with the crowd, with what everyone is saying. Chesterton fought against it vociferously in terms of the scientism of his day, the eugenics movement, lots of things, and indeed socialism eventually. But I think that that's an important thing that we maybe sometimes don't take away as much, because we do see Chesterton as that kind of lighter figure, that more lighthearted writer, but he was picking some pretty hefty, philosophical and political fights. He was not backing down from some pretty contentious issues, and very adamant about kind of the commitment to truth, to tell the truth first of all, but then also just not to go along with the convenient truths, so called, that the culture is positing for one, including, as I said, scientism, things like that. So I could certainly see the simpatico nature between these two. I think it'll be a fascinating subject.
Coming right back to a couple of points you hit on, it's very interesting. Chambers says in the book, in multiple places, he says something to this effect. He says the common man on the street in the 40s and 50s would would 100% agree with this statement. Communism, bad. Socialism, good. And he says, if you followed that up, and they're like, oh, everyone thought communism was bad. Everyone thought socialism was good. And he says, if you followed that up with a question, what's the difference? He said 99% of people couldn't tell you the difference. It was really, and I think it's really true. I think maybe it's true today too, that something very similar is going on, where a specific word might be bad, but a very similar word is good, and nobody knows why. It's just like, I have to align myself with what's popular, what's being said out on the street. So anyway, I thought that was a really interesting part of what he puts in the book.
Well, I mean, one example that just flew to my mind, I guess, because again of some of the things I've been listening and reading to, was kind of how it's the same crowd nowadays who would probably vociferously rail against censorship, and we look at sort of protests of various kinds that are being allowed to take place on college campuses, even. Well, no, I mean, protests in of themselves are fine, but menacing, let's say, and I would argue violent indications on college campuses that are being allowed to take place. But free speech is sacrosanct. We can't censor. So the same people that say that are also the people that immediately question, oh, how are you going to give this person a platform, right? How could you platform this person? And if you would ask them to say, well, again, what is the difference between deplatforming and censorship? It's either that they've just spot the lie, or they are liars themselves, or they just haven't thought through the issue. And I think probably all three, a mix of all three in that bunch. So,
yeah. No, I totally agree. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Grettelyn.
No, it's okay. It just also reminds me of a similarity with Chesterton, that he was very big on calling things what they actually were and like defining them. He has a great line somewhere, and I can't remember the quote exactly, of course, but he uses all these big words, and he's like, for the preservation of the species, we need to consume the unnecessary waste in our society. He said, if they would actually just say, let's eat our grandparents, like, it would shock you. But that's, so just kind of this idea of like taking these big words that we have as buzzwords, right? And we think, okay, this one's bad, this one's good. But like you said, asking the question, what does it mean? Have you actually thought that through, or are you just sort of sheepishly following along? this narrative that is just pulling you in a direction that maybe you don't actually want to go, but you're going there because you haven't thought it through. And people like Chesterton, and sounds like Chambers too, were making people think that through and figure out what they actually believed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know what? They're both so insightful. Again, one example, I won't give too much away, but like Chambers has this great essay in 1947 or 48. And in the essay, he says, I'm extremely worried and nervous about China. And he says, China will become communist. China will become a world power. China will rival the U.S. He says in 47. And he says, what I see happening isn't good. And, don't take them as this backwater little insignificant country. A lot of things are brewing there that look really bad. So he was very insightful, very similar to Chesterton, seeing how bad Hitler was in 1933. Like he was like, this guy's trouble. This is not good.
Whereas a lot of progressive people were like, oh, this guy's doing great things for Germany.
Exactly. Yep.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think another kind of insight that they share in their cultural observations is that these movements tend to be, it's kind of Stalin's great line about useful idiots, but they tend to be always the machinations of the elite that then get disguised as and kind of pawned off as as though they're popular movements. Chesterton famously says in one place that the mob or the rabble, if it's anything, even the revolutionary mob, is usually conservative, right? And that sounds paradoxical to us because we think, oh, wait a minute, people marching in the streets and all this, that, and the other thing. But his point is that these movements that sometimes end up swaying the mob, and we've seen plenty of this in our own lifetimes and in own recent years and decades, they come out of elite cultures. He says elsewhere in What's Wrong with the World, that the poor, especially the poor children in schools, have imposed upon them mere pedantic copies of the prejudices of the remote rich. I love that line. Pedantic copies of the prejudices of the remote rich.
That's great.
And I think we see this in spades all over our culture today. And I think that it is sort of the tragic element of Chambers' life that, you would think in a culture that ostensibly would appear to be very opposed to communism, kind of on the cusp of going into a Cold War and all the rest of this, that nevertheless he didn't find welcome because there were these sort of elite, you think of the targets of some of the hearings from out in Hollywood and things like that. And sure, some of those were kind of witch hunts, but some of them weren't, some of them, and that cultural force of making people feel like, well, okay, we're not for Bolshevism, we're not for Sovietism, but I mean, this is the way of the future. This is the way of progress. This is getting us towards greater inclusivity and everything else. Kind of as those things started to awaken towards the 60s, it was a lonely place to be that kind of voice who came from it in the context of Sovietism and said, I don't care how you dress it up. This is bad. You can't have this. Yeah.
Yeah. It was funny. I was just chatting with my son about it. And I said, it's hard for me to imagine, in the 20s and 30s, I was trying to find an analogy that would be similar. It was like, I'm getting on Facebook, or it's like, but I'm going to a communist party. Like it was super common, and it was like the cool thing to do. And many, many, many college students kind of experimented and dabbled with it. And, Chambers worked, I think, for a couple of communist papers. One was the Daily Worker. So you start Googling the Daily Worker, everybody worked for the Daily Worker. Maybe for 2 weeks, maybe 2 months, maybe 2 years, but so many people, like Joy Gresham, C.S. Lewis' wife, worked for the Daily Worker. Like everybody had to just try it out and see what communism was like. And, some were really grabbed and, got more engaged, but a lot of them just was like, I'm not so sure about this. And a lot of them left, but it was a fad. It was a gigantic fad in the U.S. to join
it's the sort of
communism group.
Yeah, well, and I think it's still happening, and it's the sort of thing that even if when you leave it, it kind of leaves a stamp on your mind that can influence you whether you know it or not. So it's kind of this. It really is kind of this shadowy thing that I think we're still living with in a lot of ways. Like there's all these polls coming out about the youngest generation now saying that communism sounds like a great idea, and like it's like no, well, they haven't been taught history in their high schools and colleges, so no wonder. But like it's just this kind of shadowy thing that I think is a continual menace. And reading people like Chambers and Chesterton who would speak against it is valuable, and we should do more of it. But
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And the motivations are always all the same. I think of, the way that Chesterton really, one of my favorite fictional character portrayals in Chesterton and all of Chesterton is Lord Ivywood in The Flying Inn, because he's a really multi-dimensional, ostensible bad guy in that book. Because Chesterton doesn't make a paper man out of him. He doesn't make him, just some sort of kind of stand-in for an evil bureaucrat or whatever. Like there's a humanism to him. I think Chesterton appreciated this, that even some people, he speaks about the divorce of the virtues and orthodoxy, where he says that the scientists have lost, scientists and humanitarians have gone in different directions. And so now the scientists have truth without pity. The humanitarians have pity without truth. And that's what I see in especially these student movements in every successive generation. It's pity without truth. And pity is a good thing, right? This is Chesterton's point about the divorce of the virtues doing more damage than just outright vice. I mean, if you look at what schools are doing to accommodate gender, non-binary, non-cis conforming, all these people, I don't think they're doing it out of malice. I don't think they're doing it to hurt kids. They're doing it from a surfeit, a surfeit of pity that lacks truth. And that's the real dangerous part about it. That's where you kind of see the diabolical sort of
just a grain of truth and the rest is a lie. Yep.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Hey, may I pivot? We've talked a lot about the monsters. We got to talk a little bit about the mystics. We got to end on a high note. We can't keep going down the dark tunnel.
Amen.
So the other half of the talk is on the mystics and on Chambers' transformation. And I do want to quote this one little part of the book that he points to as the turning point in his life. And it's a very small moment, but that's so true. That is, I think, what makes us mystics. He was deep entrenched in his communist life, in his spying work, in his copying documents and sending them to Moscow and all this stuff. And he had, kind of miraculously, he and his wife had a little girl. And the communists would have liked the girl to be aborted, and there was lots of secret ways to get an abortion in the 30s. But they didn't go through with it. Back to your point about pity, they couldn't do it. They're like, no, this is a life. We need this. But he was still into communism. And he said he was thinking about all his communist things, furtive meetings and caves and things he had to do. And his little one or 2 year old daughter was sitting in a high chair playing with her food. And he goes, she was just playing with it, looking at it, throwing it on the floor, just having a great old time. And he said, all of a sudden, he looked at her face. He says, almost like for the first time. And he saw this beautiful face, and he looked at her ears. For some reason, he said, I looked at those beautiful ears, and I said, this is not a chance colliding of atoms. This is the most beautiful design I've ever. It took his breath away. He was embarrassed. And he said, if the communist people I work with ever find out that I had this transforming moment, and I like suddenly, because he said what it meant was her ear was beautiful, but that ear pointed to something much bigger than his daughter. And it pointed to God, and it pointed to the possibility of having a soul. And he was like, this was all really dangerous stuff for a communist. So that's the other side of the story, is that he starts to see life as beautiful and as connected. And I want to be clear to say it's not Gnosticism. It's not Star Wars. It's not the Force. It's actual real things in the real world that point to something higher. So his 1-year-old daughter's little ear, suddenly, he said it was a moment. He goes, I was not Christian. I didn't believe in God. I didn't believe it. But it took my breath away. And I said, there's something more to life than what I'm doing right now. So that's the good side of the story.
I love that story. And it's such a beautiful, we always think about evangelization as talking to people and convincing people, right? But he was evangelized by his daughter who couldn't talk, by her ear. That's just so wonderful. That's only God, right? Only God could do something like that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it reminds me of that I would argue most stirring, which I know is a bold statement considering all that is stirring in Chesterton, but for my money, it's what's he calls a final instance in What's Wrong with the World, the very end of that book, where he describes this moment there at the conclusion of having written this book about society and its problems. And he gives a contemporary account of doctors as an example of what he's been railing against. He talks about doctors who decided that they had a cure for head lice, which was to shave all the poor children's heads short so that they couldn't carry lice into the schools. And he wryly comments that it never occurred to them to have abolished the lice. They decided to abolish the hair. And he's like, there are ways that you could get rid of the poverty and the conditions that are leading to the lice, but that's much harder than just shaving off the heads of the hair of the slaves, he says. So he's really fired up, and the reason is because he has just seen this little girl with beautiful red hair walking past his window, and he goes on this rhetorical tour de force, just saying about how she's the sacred and divine image. Around her, the laws of nations and whole empires will topple. She cannot be harmed, and that there is something, as you very rightly use the word mystical. There's something kind of mystical in that insight, seeing the value of the human person, infinite dignity and worth, and seeing the image of God therein. I think that's just it's a great connection to see that they shared.
Yep.
Such a hopeful thing too, because we did spend most of this podcast down in like the sewers of whatever, but
Right.
it's so great to hear about a person like Chambers who was in so deep in this system that we know is diabolical, right? It's killed millions and millions of people. It's a horrible thing. But to see someone able to respond to a miracle of grace and turn their life around, I think is so necessary, especially right now in our culture that's sort of just very rigid and does not want to forgive anybody and just cancel them and just throw them away. And it's so valuable to see someone who's turned around and just given their life to the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to remind ourselves this is possible. This is what we're aiming for. We're not looking to win the argument. We're looking to win the soul, right? We're trying to get these people back for Christ and for the good.
No, absolutely. There's so many other things, but one thing he comes back to over and over and over, and I think Chesterton would agree. Although the tone is different, he talks about his he bought a farm, and even though his whole life he worked in the big city, he loved being on the farm, and he loved describing the trees and the animals and the hillside and the creek that ran through it. And he said over and over and over, he always felt, the closest to God when he saw this wonderful beauty. And he encouraged everyone. He's like, he's not a distributist by any stretch, but he's like, get out of the city, go somewhere beautiful, look at a river, look at an ocean, so he's telling people all the time to kind of get away from busyness and big buildings and cars and trains, and like just step aside from all that and refocus your life. So that's beautiful. Kind of another part of his mysticism is just the rural life. He would say is very, very significant part of his life is being close to the land, close to the farm, close to the animals. So
beautiful.
Well, I think we're just about at time for today, Joe, but I'm going to put you on the sort of on the spot with one last question we didn't really prepare you for, but it's an easy one. You've been to several Chesterton conferences in the past, and so there's folks out there viewing, listening who have they're maybe first timers or they haven't been in a long, long time, maybe since the days when it was just every year out in Minneapolis, and they have this lingering question: why should I come to a Chesterton conference? So, as quickly as possible, why should people come to this year's Chesterton conference?
Oh gosh, so it's an easy answer. I would say, Jesus' words: "Come and see." It's very hard to convince someone of why they should come, but if you come and see, you'll experience something pretty amazing. And I know it's very cliche, but the talks are outstanding, and the program's outstanding, and it's all wonderful. But maybe what tops it is the after party, the afterglow, the speaking with a new friend from across the country, that you suddenly find yourself just enraptured in this great conversation at 2 a.m. It's like, to me, that's even the better part of the conference, is these fantastic conversations with new people out on the patio, possibly having a beverage, and it's just wonderful. Everything about it is great. So,
well, sounds good to me. I'll sign up. So, well, thank you once again, Joe. This has been a great pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And Grettelyn, thank you as always.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes,
see you in Philly.
All right.
And to you, our viewers and listeners, I'm just going to add to Joe's plug there. If you have not yet registered for the Chesterton Conference, you can do so today. Go to chesterton.org/conference, chesterton.org/conference. If for some reason, if you're abroad, if you don't travel anymore, if you, for whatever reason, can't get there in person, you can participate online, and that's a very affordable option. You can get a digital registration for the conference, and soon after the airing of this podcast episode, within the coming days, really, you will have access to our conference app. And the conference application allows you to participate in the community forum, start sharing articles with one another, start talking about your own reading and about which talks on the schedule are intriguing to you. And you might even find yourself already ahead of time in conversations with speakers. And so that's true of whether you're a digital participant or an in-person participant. We really hope to see you in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, historical Valley Forge. Come early if you like, stay late if you like, and tour the wonderful historical setting that is there. You can see where George Washington encamped with the troops famously, or you can head down into Philadelphia, visit Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell. We also have 2 saints buried here in Philadelphia, St. John Neumann, St. Catherine Drexel. So there's plenty to see, and the most important thing that we want to see at the conference, though, is you. So once again, head over to chesterton.org/conference and get your registration today, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Until next time, I'm Joe Grabowski. God bless you.